This lesson, we're going to learn how to solve a quadratic equation using the quadratic formula. Please set up your notebook. Your essential question says, how do you use the quadratic formula to solve a quadratic equation? So the first thing I want to tell you is that you can always use the quadratic formula to solve a quadratic equation. We've learned, or you've learned several different methods and to use to solve a quadratic. And you know, my students in the past, we always joked, if all else fails, if you can't remember anything else, you can always use the quadratic formula. So here is the quadratic formula. Okay, it says x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now, one thing I want to point out is the reason that it says x equals, and we've talked about this, okay? The x-intercepts are our solutions. And so that's why it says x equals. So I just want to make sure that we know x-intercepts also means solutions, which also means the zeros of the equation or function, which also means the roots. All four of these words are interchangeable. They all mean the same thing. So we need to recognize that and not be thrown off when we see those vocabulary words. I want to point out one piece of the quadratic formula that can be a little bit helpful. It is called the discriminant. The discriminant tells us how many real solutions there will be. And you'll notice it's the b squared minus 4ac. It's the part that's underneath our radical sign. And so sometimes just by knowing what the value of that is can tell us how many solutions there are, if we even need to go any further. Sometimes it will help us eliminate it. If b squared minus 4ac comes out to equal 0, then we know there is only one solution. Because think about it, if we take the square root of 0, it's just 0, right? It isn't going to give us two possible answers. Something else to think about is, what would the graph look like? So if we know there's only one solution, we've talked about that would mean our vertex is the actual solution. Whether it opens up or down, the only point that is an x-intercept would be our vertex. If our discriminant comes out to be a negative number, then that means there is no solution. We can't take the square root of a negative number because we have to have the same, it has to be the same sign. So that's not possible. If we talk about it in terms of our graph, we talked about that if there's no solution, that means the graph opens up above the x-axis or it opens down below the x-axis. And so it never crosses the x-axis and there's no solution. And then if our discriminant comes out to be a positive number, then we know there is a two solutions. Because whether it's a perfect square or not, we know that we have this plus or minus part. And so we can take positive the square root of 8, and we can take negative the square root of 8. And that would just mean that our graph crosses the axis twice. Okay, so let's talk about the quadratic formula. To use the quadratic formula, number one, our equation must be in standard form, which means it must be equal to 0. We're going to identify our a, b, and c. And maybe, wait, let me go back. Standard form, remember, is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So that's what your equation needs to look like. We're going to identify our a, b, and c, just because that will be helpful. We're going to plug our numbers into the formula, and then we're going to evaluate it. We're going to calculate it. We're going to work it out using our brains and using our calculators. I highly recommend we do as much as possible with our own brains before we pick up our calculators to help us, because sometimes we don't need our calculator. So in example 1, it's in standard form. It's equal to 0. So we're going to identify our A, B, and C. A is 1. Remember, A is always a numerical value here. Okay, we don't want to include x squared as part of it. It's understood that there's a 1 right there. B is -6, and C is 5. Okay, so now we're going to take our numbers and we're going to fill it into the quadratic formula. So x equals -b, and I know a lot of you are going to want to instantly change that to a positive, but I just want you to see us plugging it in, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c divided by 2a. So all I did right there was fill in our formula with our a, b, and c values. And so now I'm going to do some simplifying all with my own brain. We know negative and a negative makes a positive, so this is going to be +6 plus or minus square root, okay? -6 squared is +36. And then we've got -4 times 1 times 5, which makes -20, divided by 2. So I still don't need my calculator, okay? So 36 minus 20 is 16. So now it is 6 plus or minus the square root of 16 over 2. Now, let's talk about what happens now with this plus or minus. We know the square root of 16 is 4. So we've got to calculate, and because it's positive, we know that there's going to be 2 solutions. That's the 16 is our discriminant, and it tells us, okay, I'm going to have 2 solutions. So we're going to do 6 plus 4 divided by 2, and we're going to do 6 minus 4 divided by 2. Well, 6 plus 4 is 10. 10 divided by 2 is 5. So one solution, one x-intercept, one root is 5. Okay, now we're going to calculate the other one. 6 minus 4 is 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So our solutions are 5 and 1. I want to point out that if you're trying to use your calculator, you can't put it in the calculator plus or minus. That isn't going to work. You're going to have to calculate each one separately. Okay, let's look at example number 2. My A value is -3. My B value is 2. My C value is 7. It is in standard form. It is equal to 0. So I'm going to say x equals -b, -2, plus or minus the square root of 2 squared minus 4 times -3 times 7 all over 2 times -3. All I did was fill it in. I didn't do anything else at that point. Okay, so now let's see what I can calculate with my own brain. So I've got -2 plus or minus the square root of 2 squared, which is 4. -4 times -3 is +12. And +12 times 7 is 84, divided by -6. So see, I'm still using my own brain. You can use your calculator to help, but there's no reason why you can't do this with your own brain at this point. 4 plus 84 is 88, divided by -6. Okay, so now at this point, 88 is not a perfect square. And so we are going to have to use our calculator as an assistant. So remember, we're going to calculate it as 2 problems. We're going to do -2 plus the square root of 88 divided by -6. And then we're going to do -2 minus the square root of 88 divided by -6. So we're going to have to calculate that twice. We're going to round to our hundredths place. If you check these and type these into your calculator, you should get -1.23 and +1 point, and it would round to 90. Okay, so make sure that you're testing that with your calculator and that you can actually input that and get the correct answer that I got. Okay, in this last example, It is not in standard form. So we need to move the -1 over so that it's +1 equals 0. And now I'm ready to go. I'm going to encourage you right now to maybe stop this video, see if you can identify your A, B, and C, and plug it into the quadratic formula and get the same answer that I got. Your A value is 4, B is -4, C is 1, so X equals -B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times 4 times 1. I'm going fast because you were supposed to already do this on your own. Okay. When you calculate this, you're going to get 4 plus or minus the square root of 0 over 8. We talked about that if our discriminant is 0, and we know the square root of 0 is just 0, so we're actually going to have one solution because 4 plus 0 and 4 minus 0 is the same thing. So we end up with 4/8 or simply 1